Chris? Alright, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I've got a few pictures that I'll show you. It's alright if it takes a minute for them to... Okay, there we go. Alright. So there's many patterns that we see throughout the Bible that are established, and they repeat themselves over and over again. One of those patterns that we see from beginning to end is God's command for his people to be separate from the cultures around them. It starts all the way in Genesis chapter 12, where God tells Abram to get up and leave Ur and to go to a place that he will show him. And it goes all the way into the book of Revelation, up to Revelation 18, where God's people are told, in reference to the end-time Babylon, to come out lest you share in her sin. We're in the spring of the year, and it was this time of year, some 2,400 years ago, that the most extensive act of coming out is recorded in the Scriptures, and that, of course, is the Exodus, when the children of Israel came out of the land of Egypt. And it's almost Passover time again, so I thought it'd be a good time to take a look at this concept of coming out of Egypt. They, of course, came out physically from the land of Egypt, and we say that we come out of a spiritual Egypt at baptism. So we see, though, that even after they were taken out, that they were constantly tempted to go back to Egypt, or later on to ask help from Egypt. And even immediately when they went out, they took the customs of Egypt with them. And we are also tempted to do these things spiritually on our journey out of Egypt. So I want to look at that just briefly today. Now we know how the Israelites had been slaves for some time in Egypt, how it says that they toiled in bondage, and how God saved them with just a series of unbelievable miracles. And really, when you think about it, if it was written in any other book besides the Bible, you would not believe it. But because it comes from the mouth of God, we know that we can trust it. But they have all these miracles performed for them. They go out into the wilderness, and at the first sign of trouble, they are practically begging to go back. And sometimes that has us scratching our heads thinking, they were slaves. Could it really have been that good in Egypt? And, well, aside from the whole slavery thing, the answer is probably yes. Comparatively speaking, Egypt was probably, materially anyway, the best place on earth to live at that time. They usually had plentiful food. No one was starving in Egypt because the Nile River is so regular. The agriculture was fantastic. They had the best technology available at the time. They had systems of education and art and architecture that would not be rivaled, were the envy of other nations. They had a large army. They had secure borders because they were protected on all sides, or on 3 out of 4 sides, by deserts. It was very hard to invade Egypt. And they were a very old culture. Even the pyramids had already been there by the time of Moses for hundreds of years. So if you could go ahead. And that's a picture that I took. That's how big the pyramids are. Those are like 5-story apartment buildings you see in the foreground in Cairo. Nothing even approached this scale anywhere in the world. And it is still just massive, even by today's standards. Even 1,000 years later, the Greeks, which conquered Egypt, and then later the Romans, which conquered the Greeks and got possession of Egypt, marveled at what the kind of the glory that was left. I mean, it was ancient at that point. And even the Greek historian Herodotus said that the Egyptians must have been the best and the most ancient of cultures, because even by then the ruins were already thousands of years old. Right. Speaking of Moses, this is Hatshepsut's tomb. Some historians think this was his mother, who drew him out of the water. And they just built it right into the cliffside. Pretty massive. So, physically speaking, Egypt was the place to be. But, of course, morally, religiously, ethically, that was a completely different story. They were wholly corrupt. The society ran on the back of slave labor, the Israelites and others. The Pharaoh was basically a totalitarian dictator. The social system was so rigid, if you weren't in the top crust, you had no opportunity to go anywhere or do anything. At the common level, superstition was rampant, with magical potions and incantations. Talismans are found in the archaeological record, incantations that you'll say to get your spirit to go to the good part of the afterlife, and things like that. And of course, idolatry was universal, just everywhere. And I want to stop at that point, and we'll look at a few more pictures. Idolatry, like I said, was universal. It was literally, in the literal sense of literal, it was literally everywhere. It was part of home life, of art, of literature, government, architecture. You could not go anywhere where you didn't see what we would call pagan symbols. Go ahead. That first one was just out on the streets, lining the processional streets. These are in temples. Go ahead. Of course, you see the winged things, the weird-headed gods, the big crowns denoting divinity. Even the Pharaoh considered himself an incarnation, a literal incarnation of God on earth. So when you see all these things, and it was bright and it was colorful. Is that the last one? Keep going. Yeah, that's in one of the tombs. That's the original color. This tomb was sealed off for thousands of years, probably 3,000 years before they uncovered it. That's the original color. Bright yellows, blues, oranges. Look at all the idolatry there. So when you think about it this way, is it any wonder why when they were out of Egypt and they finally stop at Sinai and Moses goes up to the mountain and he's gone for 40 days and they think he might be dead, that they get Aaron to mold a golden calf for them. All right, you can shut it down. Because that's the kind of thing that they had seen all their lives. Not just them, but their parents and their parents' parents. It seems very strange to us, but it was not even second nature to them. It was first nature. That is what they had always seen in Egypt. But just because it was natural for them to do doesn't mean that God was pleased with that. And you can see how angry he was if you go to Exodus 32. So let's go ahead and go to Exodus chapter 32 and verse 7. We cut in right here in this story where Aaron has them melt down their gold and they make this golden calf. And God sees what's going on and he tells Moses, "The Lord said to Moses, go get down, for your people who you brought out of the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way which I commanded them. They have made themselves a molded calf and worshipped it and sacrificed to it and said, 'This is your God, O Israel, that brought you out of the land of Egypt.'" And I was reading a Bible commentary. The Rational Bible Commentary points out that this word, corrupted, in verse 7, literally in the Hebrew means destroyed. They have destroyed themselves. We would say in English, they've ruined everything. Why is he so mad? Because he had taken them out. He had introduced he had introduced himself to the people. He had symbolically baptized them in the Red Sea. He'd done all these things, and it was like they never even left. And so he tells Moses, they're ruining everything I'm trying to do. And Moses, of course, has to intercede with him because God was understandably very upset. Now, for Christians, it's a little bit different. Christ prayed to the Father in John chapter 17. He says, I've given them your word, so I have introduced them to you. Just like Moses brought them out and taught, introduced them to God and gave them the law. And Jesus says, the world hated them because they are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. But I do not pray that you should take them out of the world, so we don't actually come out physically like the Israelites did in Egypt, but that you should keep them from the evil one. God calls people from all different cultures all around the world, here in the U.S., Canada, in Ghana, in India, in Australia, in Chile, everywhere. But we don't have to physically move out. We don't go to some promised land. He calls us to stay mostly where we're at. And we're in the world, but we're not of the world. And this has always been the case. And it's always been hard. Even the earliest Christians that we read about in the book of Acts, they start to come out of Judaism. They start making their own culture, their own community, and it runs into persecution, and they have to spread out from there. And as they're going throughout the rest of the Roman Empire, it begins to spread with them, and they take it other places with them. And then God draws people in those places as well, and they're coming out of that culture, even though they're physically still there. And we see that at work in 1 Peter. 1 Peter 4, verse 3. If I can get there. It says, "For we have spent enough of our past lifetime in doing the will of the Gentiles, when we walked in lewdness, lust, drunkenness, revelries, drinking parties, and abominable idolatries. In regard to those, they think it strange that you do not run with them in the same flood of dissipation, speaking evil of you." It's like, yeah, the people you used to know, the friends you used to have, they think you're weird now because you're different. You are different than them now. It was obvious that they were something different now, and it remained that way. You can look through the historical record. I came across one thing in something I was reading. We have a Roman author writing about 200 years after the death of Christ, and he summed up what most Romans thought about the Christians at that time. Here's what he said. He said, "They despise the temples as houses of the dead. They reject the gods. They laugh at the sacred things. They pity our priests. They despise honors and purple robes. They do not attend the sporting events. They have no interest in the public amusements, reject public banquets, and abhor the sacred games." Well, because what the Romans called sports, like gladiatorial combat, usually involved someone dying in front of everyone. The more gruesome, the better, usually, for the crowds. The plays that you would see in the public theaters were usually about some intrigue going on with the royalty and all the nasty things that they did. The banquets would all begin with a ceremonial sacrifice. All the sacred games were dedicated to this god or that god. Of course, the Christians didn't want them and take part in them. So I just want to encourage us. I think I'm out of time. I just want to encourage us at this point to think about how we interact with the world and the culture that we have around us. In a lot of ways, it's like ancient Egypt. It's kind of the pinnacle of what we've got right now. Like the ancient Israelites were so quick to bring the idolatry with them because it was just everywhere around them. Do we have something that we're bringing along with us, even after our exodus from spiritual slavery? Are we going back like they did later on after they had established their kingdoms to ask for help? Are we trying to get advice from the world? The Passover's coming. There's not a better time. I mean, of course we should be doing this throughout the year, but there's not a better time to ask ourselves, are we in the world or are we of the world? How do we, what do we enjoy? What company do we keep? How do we treat others? What occupies most of our time? Are we keeping away from the evil one, or are we ruining everything because it's like we never left? Now, of course, we all fail in some ways, but God gives us mercy, and God gives us hope, and God gives us the Spirit to overcome those things. So let's thank God that He does give us that clarity, and He does give us that chance, and He does give us that power to complete our journey out of Egypt.